Ladies and gentlemen, good evening from me. It's a great pleasure to be tonight here with you, and it's with great joy that I address you this evening, which is a most auspicious occasion for me personally and for the two institutions that I have the honor to represent, that is the young and very active Sylvia Ioannou Foundation, about which you've just heard, and the Historical and Ethnological Society of Greece, one of the oldest historical and cultural societies of Greece, born in 1882. It is the first launching of our book, History Has a Face, Figures of 1821, in Athenian Greece by the Belgian diplomat Benjamin Marie in its English translation. This is the English cover, and this is the Greek one. The Greek edition has already had a year's life in the bookshops in Athens, with, may I say, a great success, as it's running already its first reprint, which is something very important in Greece. This book, in either of its versions, Greek or English, which are identical, is a traveling capsule in time and place, to the reader, offering to the reader a glimpse of the past of Greece. The edition coincided with the 200th anniversary of the outbreak of the Greek War of Independence, an event that changed Europe. The Greek Revolution, may I remind you of it, is the event that, in fact, broke up the Holy Alliance of 1814 and upset completely the balance of powers in southeastern Europe. It gave birth to a new state, a Christian one, where only an Ottoman province had existed for more than 4 centuries. A state that was recognized and accepted in the European family after the famous naval battle of Navarino in 1827, when the combined naval forces of Great Britain, France, and Russia fought and destroyed the fleet of the Ottoman Empire and Egypt on behalf of the Greeks. This point of view is not a hyperbole. Oh, no, not at all. As you all know, the Greek War of Independence is one of the major political and diplomatic events of the 19th century. Nowadays, it is downplayed and barely mentioned in the history school books all over Europe, as the prevailing fashion is for tracing mainly the process of decolonization and the history of those parts of our world that lived under this regime and suffered accordingly. The Greeks lived until 1821 under an equally bad regime, maybe even worse. They were not recognized as having the least right to life itself. They were slaves in the worst sense of the word. Their revolution was, among other things, the first great reaction to slavery. And banning slavery in the new Greece was one of the first acts of the first government. It was an uprising that threatened the difficult balance of powers in Europe after the Napoleonic Wars and the hard-bought peace of 1815. These Greeks not only rose against their so-called lawful masters, as it was then considered, but they also claimed equal rights to all established states in Europe and chose for themselves an absolutely democratic and republican way of government, convened assemblies, and elected a parliament, a fact that could not meet with the approval of the concert of Europe that ruled the continent and more. The Greeks, given their character, very easily fell out between themselves and ended by fighting 2 civil wars even as the Ottoman Empire had called the Egyptian land and sea force to help. This force massacred and enslaved the population and destroyed Greek islands like Kassos and Psara in 1824 and 25, and landed in Crete, where they started slowly but steadily to neutralize the Greek forces.
Recording in progress.
In the end, they landed in the Morea with no one to stop them. It was the occasion that Austria, France, Russia, and even Britain had expected and waited for. To overcome the insurgent Greeks, this solution sounded easy, but the Greeks were hardier. Missolonghi was taken after a year-long siege and the heroic exodus of the able-bodied defenders. The rest of them decided to blow themselves up so as not to fall captive. The fall of Missolonghi awoke public opinion in Europe and raised a wide demand for freedom for the Greeks and the ousting of the Egyptian army from Europe. The public wanted a crusade against the Muslim Ottomans. It was, of course, a time when different religions and denominations still divided the world. Just a year later, Navarino was the result of this public outcry. All this is fairly well known among Greeks, but it is really unknown anywhere else except Greece. And the 200th anniversary of our liberty has not made the facts so well known as not to need to be repeated again and again. We were the first nation in Europe to rise and overthrow the rule of a foreign people who discriminated against us in terms of race, religion, and social status, and had started thinking about a genocide against us. We became an example for national uprisings all over the continent, and finally for all people who claimed their liberty and their rights. That is why tonight is interesting. We are here to present to you a book depicting the personalities that made this revolution, turned it into a war of independence, and won our liberty for us. The title is An Introduction to a Truth. We know very little about the men that gave us our liberty and our new state. Now, history does have a face. Let me make myself clear. The book that I have the honor to present to you this evening is a facsimile reproduction of an album of sketches drawn between the years 1839 and 1844 in Greece by Benjamin Marie, the first Belgian diplomatic representative to Athens. It contains more than 300 portraits of the people who fought for 10 years non-stop, an all-out merciless struggle in Greece. Most are Greek, but a few Philhellenes are included. And here, ladies and gentlemen, my story becomes completely personal, because this book is an answer to a long-held wish that was fulfilled 30 years later. I had seen the original a certain spring afternoon of 1991, and then I had not been told who the owner was. Well, I could give a good guess. At the time, I had already started to work on its sister album with Marie's sketches of Greek women of the same periods. That book came out in 1992. And funnily enough, is now completely out of print, even though then it didn't sell at all well, given its very high price. I had asked at the time to author and edit the book that you see today, but I was told it was better to get on with the women as they looked more decorative, and in Athens in those days, it was a fashion for coffee table books that looked completely glamorous. Of course, I tried, and I think that I succeeded in part, in making even that into an interesting book. This new one, as you will be able to see, although it is extremely interesting, could not by any means be called decorative. And so, to come to our new edition, I cannot describe to you the curiosity with which I responded 4 years ago to a phone call by my friend Dimacopoulou, asking me to join her and her colleague and mutual friend Iphigenia, both curators at the National Historical Museum, to a visit to the then unknown to me Sylvia Ioannou Foundation in Athens to see an album of portraits by Benjamin Marie that might interest me. My surprise was considerable when I saw the premises of the foundation and the many treasures that it contained. And of course, to my great enthusiasm, I saw the album in question. It was the long-lost album of 1991. I had the opportunity now to look through it, and it was a great joy. I also met for the first time the two ladies, Mrs. Sylvia Ioannou, founder and soul of the foundation, and Mrs. Artemis Skoutari, its moving spirit and director, who subsequently became good friends. I already knew Dr. Maria Iouroukou, who, as I found out, was now working at the foundation. I also met the rest of their brilliant staff. I learned that my name had cropped up because in the sale where the album was acquired by the foundation, they were also auctioning the original album of the women's portraits and a copy of the edition of 1992. The Sylvia Ioannou Foundation acquired the album containing the male portraits because, as you already heard, it contained 4 portraits of Cypriot personalities of the Greek War of Independence, as well as a second one containing watercolors of Greek and Cypriot landscapes. In the third album, there were no Cypriot portraits, so it could not be bought by a Cyprological institution. But I can tell you that it has been bought by a Greek collector and could be seen at the great exhibition at the Benaki Museum earlier this year. The Sylvia Ioannou Foundation had contacted the Historical and Ethnological Society, National Historical Museum, to ask for help in printing the album in question with a commentary and for people suitable to collaborate in the plan. So there we were, Dimitra, Iphigenia and I, as well as Dr. George Tsedopoulos, asked to take part in the project. I must admit that there was no question of refusing. I could have said, but didn't, that I believe in dreams coming true, and given that we are in the countdown for Christmas, even in the existence of Father Christmas. I was being asked to work on the sketches that I had been unable to forget since 1991, and more than that, hadn't stopped regretting that the second book had not been made. We started with rather a restricted plan, which changed as we went along with our research. The material obliged us to extend the text and turn an informative pictorial edition into a serious study and a kind of biographical dictionary, with entries for people not contained in any other dictionary. Very many of the people depicted had not been ever seen iconographically before. Why was this book so important? Because it contains, as I was subsequently able to count for myself, more than 300 sketches Portraits of those great men that made the Greek War of Independence not only possible, but victorious too. Those that had survived the war had been drawn 20 years after 1821 in their late middle or their old age. It could have been called the warrior's rest, but it was not quite that. Most portraits were drawn at the time of the National Assembly of 1843, after the so-called Revolution of the 3rd of September 1843 against King Otto, the first sovereign of Greece. I have been working for more than 35 years on this period of Greek history, researching, writing, and speaking about the facts, the legal history, and the institutions introduced then. I had come to realize that in contrast to accepted ideas, the royal pair, Otto and Amalia, although Germans, had become more than Greek and had embraced all ideas Greek. Most of all, they had identified with the aspirations of the people they had been called to rule over, that is, with the great idea, the Megali Idea. They had ranged Greece on the side of Russia during the Crimean War, and so against Britain and France, who considered themselves as the protecting powers of Greece. But in this case, Russia, a third protecting power, was fighting against the Ottoman Empire, whereas the other two were allies of the Sultan. Greece hoped to broaden its borders to include the regions that had remained outside the Greek kingdom. So Greece came out on the side of Russia. That is why the royal pair lost the support of London and Paris, a fact that eventually led to their dethronement in 1862. But Otto and Amalia never got over the loss of the throne of thorns that was Greece, and died of nostalgia in Bavaria a few years later, having felt as exiles in their native land. I had a good idea of who Benjamin Marie was, having written a short biography 30 years ago in the previous book. It had been established that he was born in Mons, now in Belgium, in 1792. He was a genuine child of the French Revolution, growing up in Napoleonic Europe with the ideals of liberty, fraternity, and equality. He died in Bagnères de Luchon, a French spa in the foothills of the Pyrenees, on the 21st of July, 1846, of bad health, never having accepted the fact that he was not allowed to return to Greece. Now, the opportunity to learn more from his diplomatic correspondence was offered. George Zedopoulos accepted the task of going to Brussels and searching there in the historical archives of the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs for more information on Marie. The results of his research were very rich. Our diplomat not only found the time to travel all over the small kingdom of the 1840s, but also managed to come to a head-on collision with the British minister in Athens, Sir Edmund Lyons. Of course, Lyons had the last word and demanded that Marie be recalled to Brussels and never allowed back to Greece. Marie had had the impression that the British envoy was working against the interests of the Greek people, snubbing them and their aspirations. The British diplomatic correspondence produced even more information on the subject. On the other hand, Marie was very proud of his sketching ability. But we must remember that the ability to draw and paint in watercolors was part of the educational curriculum of all upper-class children, boys and girls, in the 19th century. Before the days of photography, sketching was the only way to bring back pictures of places visited and people met in travels. To those early travelers, we owe an enormous lot of information ever since the 17th century. Some chose to employ for their pictorial memories a genuine artist engaged for the duration of the trip and sightseeing. Their engravings in the travel books of the Grand Tour have turned these into a valuable collection of added visual information. Marie was no exception to the custom. He was quite able, but he didn't have the means to employ an artist whom he didn't need anyway. He was quite able to sketch and put down his impressions on paper. He was recognized in his country as a very able artist, mainly of the flora of Brazil, a country where he had served previously as a diplomat. From his reports from Greece, we learn that he showed his work to everybody, even to King Otto and Queen Amelia, or to the Egyptian Pasha Muhammad Ali, when later he traveled to Egypt in 1845. He also reported the fact of his sketching during the sessions of the Assembly to his superior, the Belgian Foreign Minister. In his reports, he often speaks of the difficult conditions under which he made his sketches in his effort to immortalize as many persons as he could. It seems that as his knowledge of the Greek language was not at a satisfactory level, he made a great effort to comprehend the climate of the Assembly of 1843-44, to interpret the gestures and to understand the speeches. On the 31st of January 1844, he notes, and I quote, "I study carefully so mercurial a nation which admires and occasionally condemns people and things with equal vehemence and jumps from one subject to another with a rapidity that is entirely original. He managed, however, with hasty strokes, to capture almost photographically the expressions, the features, the psychological makeup, and the varied costumes of his subjects with great success. Marie manifested the same enthusiasm for the portraits of the spectators, whom he approached with the same seriousness of purpose. As he wrote, "My portfolio of deputies has been finalized. It consists of 82 portraits. At the moment, I am concerned with the public, the various costumes and the picturesque figures who have come from every corner of Greece to attend the debates, which they follow with incredible attention, which lends their physiognomies a remarkable expression of intelligence." And drawing the spectators, he also displayed his sense of humor, trying to catch their vivid interest and sometimes the boredom, even to the extent of falling asleep in the chamber, as you can see at the bottom of the picture, that they felt. Well, no assembly can be amusing all the time. I cannot imagine how they must have received such reports in Brussels instead of political information. But Marie, for some reason, had his sovereign's favor. Possibly King Leopold of Belgium still kept a soft place in his heart for the country, the crown of which he had refused. You remember that Leopold had been elected in 1830 as a reigning prince of the small independent Greek principality that the three powers, Britain, France, and Russia, had hoped to see after the Battle of Navarino. It would solve the problem in the Eastern Mediterranean, and they could get on with their veiled conflict for supremacy in the area. Marie was the person that would enable the Belgian king to see and appreciate the land he had refused to rule, as well as the people he had not undertaken to govern. He had avoided the difficult task, but he may have kept a nostalgic point of view for Greece and its people. So, the Belgian foreign minister allowed Marie great leeway to keep on sketching. Anyway, the main reason for his accreditation to Athens had been concluded successfully, and the economic and commercial treaty between Belgium and Greece had been signed and ratified by both governments in the autumn of 1840. After that, his presence in Greece was rather a way of showing mutual friendship between the two countries, two small kingdoms born in the same decade of early 19th century Europe. Two states that, even though small, which to all purposes should have been insignificant, had turned out to be very important geopolitically. Belgium as a buffer state between France and the German-speaking world to its north. Greece as a possible maritime force and probable ally of Britain in the southeast of Europe. After sorting out the question of the biography of the author of our sketches, we had to come to grips with the sketches themselves. There we were, three historians, faced with the figures of more than 300 portraits to identify and to compile short biographical notices about them. Of course, very soon the sketches were divided into two lots, those of the people depicted and named in the album, and those about whom we had not a single identifying clue. We concentrated, as would be normal, on those named by Benjamin Marie. I must add that after he drew portraits for which he had asked the people to sit, he asked his subjects to sign them. And in that, he was not an original. Others had asked their subjects to sign. I refer, of course, both to Adam Friedel, here, and Karl Kratzheisen, both Germans. Friedel has appended an inexistent signature of Kolokotronis in his picture here, asked somebody to do some kind of a signature to add, whereas in Kratzheisen's portrait, the signature is original. Then Marie added the place and date of the drawing. So we had some information to go on. Some of the people portrayed are well known, very well known, as Kolokotronis and Nikitaras and Makrianis. Though I should point out that Makrianis looks quite different to how we think of him, based on a sketch by Kratzheisen made in 1827. For the well-known people, generally, it was just a question of deciding what to put in the book and what to leave out. As anyone can readily discover, on most well-known figures of the War of Independence, there is information in encyclopedias and biographical dictionaries. Here and there are reliable monographs written about them, as well as some biographies based on research. But I do have to point out that even in that respect, there are great omissions. For example, no scholarly biography of Kolokotronis exists. It is a huge lack in our bibliography, and it has not been remedied even now in this festive year that is ending. We had to do a lot of research to finally compile a short notice about the less well-known figures. It took real archival research, and the results were very interesting. though all three of us had a good knowledge of the prosopography of the War of Independence, there were names we couldn't recognize. In the case of others, however, in fact, as to the whole host of fighters in the War of Independence, we have a minimum of information, or absolutely none, either because they were not important enough in the estimation of the lexicographers or the researchers, or because they died without descendants to keep up their memory, or just because of sheer stupidity. Only about 1971, when the 150th anniversary of the Revolution of 1821 was celebrated, some attempt was made at the compilation of such studies, or even of some lists by prefecture or region. However, in the case of many of those depicted here, not only was archival research required, but also an attempt to clarify who exactly they were in case of namesakes. The identification of secondary fighters in the struggle called for research in specialist scholarly journals and local periodicals or other printed matter, which modern historical research usually overlooks, as well as searching through the daily press of the period. We even bothered families with our questions. They were kind enough to assist us, and we take this opportunity to thank them warmly. I must also explain that in this album there are 114 full-page portraits, like the one you see on the screen, either of a single person or two or more, up to 6, and the rest, about 130 persons, are depicted on 9 pages drawn in haste while Marie was following the sessions of the assembly, as I told you. Those last depict, as already mentioned, the delegates and a few of the spectators in the chamber. Some people are named and others are not. Some are named erroneously, and in one or two cases the names are correct but written under the sketch of the wrong person. So you can imagine our task. What we came to realize was the fact that among the spectators were many of the people that had failed to be elected as delegates, and also quite a few relations of those already elected. They came from all over the Greek world, not only the few areas included in the Little Kingdom, but also from the Ionian Islands, Cyprus, Macedonia, Thessaly, Epirus, Crete, and all the other regions of the Greek-speaking world. This gave a slightly different sociological approach to the public of the assembly. The aspirations of all, delegates and spectators alike, were unanimous. They all hoped for a constitution to safeguard their interests, as well as a new era in the sharing of power. Many hoped to exclude non-indigenous to the small kingdom fellow Greeks, so as to obtain higher places in the hierarchy of the state, ministerial posts, and other benefits. But in this way, they managed to exclude, thankfully only for a year or two, personalities who had studied in Europe or the Ionian Islands, and so were really better fitted for the higher posts. Among others, they excluded from the one and only university of the time, the Athens one, the great historian Constantine Paparrigopoulos. After working for about 2 years, we had finished with the people named by Benjamin Marie and had compiled their notices. And then one day, as we were trying to decide if it was all finished, I suddenly recognized one of the nameless portraits. It was the one you can see on the screen. It was George Finley, the historian and Philhellene. So, off we went again to try and see who else we could identify based on our experience of the portraits in the National Historical Museum, other museums and public collections, and the printed material, mainly magazines of the 19th century, where obituaries were printed with a small lithographic portrait. So, by trial and error, we managed to identify about 30 persons more and add to the book their biographies. Of course, there are still quite a few unidentified ones. A few surprises were in store. We were able to identify 3 of the top journalists of the 1840s, that is, Constantine Levidis, Ioannis Philemon, and Emmanuel Antoniadis. Of these, who all reported on the work of the assembly, Philemon belonged to the partisans of the so-called Russian party. Antoniadis was very well disposed towards the king, so must be counted rather as neutral to the parties, whereas Levidis, also pro-Ottonian, was rather friendly towards the French party. All 3 were great liberals and believed in the freedom of the press. It was naturally very interesting to prove that they were not only editors and owners of their respective newspapers, but also reporters in full action. We also identified 2 women among the spectators. The first one was the Duchess of Plazas, a woman of great character and importance, of mixed French and American descent, daughter-in-law of one of Napoleon's generals. She lived a life of a romantic heroine, established herself in Athens, and died there. Very lately, may I say, a donation to the All Athenians Association, Σύλλογος των Αθηναίων, has brought to light memorabilia of this lady, mainly the furniture of her drawing room, intact and in use almost until last year. It will be on display at a small new museum that is being put together in the premises of the association. The Duchess became, in 1843, the sponsor of Ioannis Koletis, one of the prime movers of the Constitutional Party. The other female figure we discovered and identified was then still in her teens, but became in time one of the characters of parliamentary life of the 1870s in Athens as a supporter of the conservative leader Theodore Veligiannis. She was Anthousa de Rougou, known as Mistress Rougou, Kyra Rougou, in the Greek newspapers of the time, and a subject for cartoonists. You can see the young girl and the cartoon later in the same century. The album was a voyage of discovery to many things. First of all, we realized that the people drawn by the Belgian diplomat were there in front of our eyes, in their true likeness, not idealized, as we had previously seen them in the existent portraits. For example, Theodore Kolokotronis, in his last days, did not look at all like the heroic figure we were used to. He was old and tired. He looked exactly like his death mask displayed in the National Historical Museum. Nikitaras, on the other hand, had stopped looking like an ancient Greek hero and looked like a beaten old man because he had been in prison for his ideas just before he went blind, probably because of cataract. The album also disclosed the face of Lazarus Condoriotis, always drawn in profile. This chief citizen of Hydra, head of the great Condoriotis family of ship owners, chose to show himself in profile because he was thought to be blind. But he was not. As one of his direct descendants, Ambassador Andreas Condoriotis disclosed to me years ago he had been born with one eye brown and the other blue. This is not so unusual as generally thought. History tells us that both Aristoteles and Alexander the Great had the same condition, called heterochromia iridis. But by the Greek seamen of the time, it was considered an omen of very bad luck, probably of shipwreck, definitely of bad business. So Lazarus used to cover his one eye, probably the blue one, to avoid bad luck and the refusal of the islanders of Hydra to sail in his family's ships. For Marie, as you see, he posed smilingly in a frontal pose that allows us to form a quite different opinion of this face and maybe even of his personality. I must add that he was distinguished for the fact that he very rarely left his island to visit the capital, either Nauplia or later Athens. Even the royal pair, Otto and Amelia, visited him instead of the usual custom of him attending the court. The sketch depicting Kolokotronis dead, lying in state at his home, is exactly what we had previously known from the newspapers on the 8th of February of 1843. The newspapers of the day reported the deceased was adorned with the uniform of Commander-in-Chief. He was wearing the sword which he had at the start of the revolution, with the helmet at his side and the epaulets of his service in the Ionian Islands, and his breastplate lying next to him, and with tsarouchia, his own footwear, on his feet. About the same goes for the venerable former Prince of Wallachia, Ioannis Karatzas, lying instead in his turn a few months later in December of the same year. It is an unexpected pair of sketches, but very true and informative. I should add that the two men had had a family connection since February 1843, when the son of Kolokotronis, Constantine, the famous Kolinos, had married Karatzas' granddaughter Ralou, thus joining two great families. Theodore Kolokotronis had jokingly said that this marriage had joined the warrior's sheepskin to the princely furs. Πάντρεψε την κάπα με τη γούνα. The two men, although coming from different backgrounds, greatly appreciated each other. So both deaths occurred in the same extended family. They also occurred in the small but select upper society of the small Athens of the time. Both resulted in national mourning, and Karatzas' funeral occasioned the postponement of the work of the National Assembly for a day. As Marie reported in his diplomatic correspondence, both had accepted him as a friendly visitor at their Athenian homes while alive. It was an honor, and he had seen it as such. These two personalities, as well as a few more that he drew carefully, had impressed the Belgian diplomat. He viewed them as living legends, and as such presented them to his Belgian audience. I truly wonder how these sketches, especially the one of Kolokotronis, had been received by the ruler of Egypt, Muhammad Ali, father of Ibrahim Pasha, who had tried to conquer the Maria in the name of the Sultan, but with the veiled plan of enslaving and transporting the population to Egypt so as to increase the latter's productivity. The small society of the capital of Athens was multicultural and varied. When Athens was chosen as a capital, in preference to Nauplia, which had been the capital since 1824, and various other towns, it was small, virtually destroyed by the fortunes of war between 1821 and 1834, when it was finally liberated. It had not been rebuilt seriously, as many decided to wait until the final decision about the capital should be reached, as many wished to settle in the seat of power. The choice of Athens, due to King Otto's father, King Ludwig I of Bavaria, a great philhellene and admirer of ancient Greece, along with women, led to the settlement of many people coming from all over the Greek world, both free and under Ottoman rule. This can be easily seen in Marie's sketches. The Belgian artist didn't care at all for Greece's ancient past. He definitely was no antiquarian. In all his sketches, what he wanted to show was a society of a country born from a liberal revolution against the tyrannical rule of the Ottomans, a society of romantical heroes in the vein of Baron's Giaour. There are only 2 or 3 sketches of ancient monuments, mainly the Acropolis of Athens, seen as a citadel on top of the small Greek capital, as you can see, and the Temple of Neptune at Sunion, as seen from the sea. Marie couldn't care less about ancient ruins. In his reports, although he must have passed important sites like Mycenae and Olympia, he showed not the least interest in them, didn't even report passing through those places. On the other hand, when he was invited to stay in Caritana at the Kolokotronis stronghold, he wrote long and picturesquely about his experience, even to what he ate and how he did. In the album, there is also a great number of clerics, whether bishops and archbishops, or priors of monasteries and single anchorites in small monasteries. I believe that he wanted to show that the clerics of the Greek Orthodox Church were important personalities, people of culture and wisdom, kindly figures integrated completely in Greek society, something that the Greeks know very well, but the Europeans of the time had difficulties in understanding. Both Catholics and the various Protestant denominations hoped to evangelize the Greeks, as they regarded the religion of the small state as almost idolatrous. Marie did not accept this point of view. Also, he admired these clerics as he realized that they had taken part in the Greek War of Independence and so had gained a place in his pantheon. The encounter with educated clerics was one of the surprises for Benjamin Marie's public outside Greece. What prevailed more generally was the image of tough, mountain-dwelling savages, which was rendered a constant in European literature for many years by the somewhat later novel by Edmond About, Le Roi des Montagnes, came out in Paris in 1857, the starting point, inter alia, for the Greek 19th century pulp fiction genre of the picaresque, known in Greek as the thievery novel. They also were old people, and it seems that Marie admired old age as an achievement per se. Probably he was right to have this point of view, as he himself died fairly young in his 54th year. It was not unusual in those days, but not the general rule either. The National Assembly that Marie followed was crucial in the further development of the Greek kingdom. It came into being after the so-called Revolution of the 3rd of September of 1843, in truth, a bloodless uprising in Athens, sponsored in the background by the ministers of France and Britain. One of the Greek historians of the time reports that the 2 diplomats directed the decisions of the rebels as they sat at the British Embassy playing cards, probably Pharaoh, a game not quite unlike poker, or even bridge. The local reason for the uprising was the demand of public positions by veterans of the War of Independence, who definitely didn't qualify for these, and the general demand for a constitution. It had been 15 years that Greece had lived without a parliament. The constitution of 1827 had been suspended by John Kapodistrias, the president of Greece, in the period 1828-31, just after his arrival, in the effort to establish peace and better conditions among the people and prevent the factions of notables from fighting for power and influence, as well as dipping in the national revenues at will. After Kapodistrias' murder, the situation had deteriorated further into civil war and factions, a fact that led to 10 more years without a parliament after the arrival of King Otto and the regency that ruled Greece in his name in the first 3 years. Otto didn't really believe in parliamentary rule, definitely not in the spirit of what the Greeks wanted. Constitutional rule in post-Napoleonic Europe meant in reality a rule in which only the higher classes and the ones that were rich enough took part. In Greece, ever since its first chamber was convened in 1822, the voting was really general, with no exceptions among men, but of course didn't include women. That can't be regarded as non-democratic, as no vote was granted to women, even during the French Revolution. No Western European upper-class member could accept the fact that fortuneless people could vote and have a voice in the rule of the country over the rich and aristocratic. But the Greek kingdom didn't have an aristocracy, and very few people were really rich. There were big landowners, of course, who wielded power, but the idea was that everybody was equal. It was, funnily enough, an idea that had survived the Roman rule, when all Christians had been equally slaves. The sessions of the Assembly of 1843-44 were very interesting to our Belgian diplomat and artist. The talks of equality and the general vote must have seemed to him as the last glimmer of French revolutionary ideas, of which he seems to have been a partisan. He felt a sincere enthusiasm about the event of the uprising of the 3rd of September and took part in earnest in sponsoring the whole effort for elections and the convening of the Assembly. It is probable that his lack of good knowledge of Greek prevented him from following the often tempestuous sessions of the Assembly. It is probable that his lack of good knowledge of Greek prevented him from following the often tempestuous sessions of the Assembly. Perhaps that is why he preferred to sketch the people who composed the body of the delegates and the faces of the public. It produced an unequal pictorial record of an event that could not have been illustrated otherwise, given that photography had not been invented yet, and which has remained unexplored until the edition of our book. As an artist, Marie is not really good. He has the gift of catching the faces of his subject. He was an outstanding physiognomist. On the other hand, he had not had a formal artistic education as far as we know. He could sketch and catch resemblances, but didn't really know about anatomy, and in no case could he draw arms and hands properly. His proportions are often bad, but it cannot be regarded as a flaw in a historical way, given that his sketches are more of a historical document than artwork. And as such a document, they should be regarded. In selecting his subjects, Marie enjoyed great advantages. He was not bound by considerations of how great, well-known, or glorious a personality he had before him, or at least this was not a criterion for immortalizing them. Thus, in the album, former freedom fighters, generals, politicians, metropolitan bishops, and diplomats coexist harmoniously with old seamen, fishermen, convicts, monks, and town criers whom the artist came across in the capital or on his travels. He opted for the picturesque or for the heroic dimensions of his subject. We know that sometimes he gave a copy, a second sketch, to the person who had sat for him, if asked for it. Our colleague in research, Ifigenia Voyadzi, discovered the fact. One of Marie's sketches in the present album, which bears no indication of identification, date, or place, was clearly a preliminary drawing of the portrait of the Spetsiot Pavlos Hadzianargyros, which is to be found in the portraits collection of the National Historical Museum, and which was painted many years after the subject's death. He also delighted in drawing men's and women's long locks of hair and beards. They look rather like the branches and roots of trees he had drawn in Brazil. He acted in the spirit of the artistic trends of Romanticism and Orientalism, something which can be seen particularly in his portraits of women or in the details of the costumes. But in his case, this trait is rather exaggerated. He chose to draw only what he saw as different to the prevailing figures of Western Europe. That is why he has left only rudimentary sketches of people dressed in European fashion, like Alexander Mavrokordatos and Spiridon Trikoupis. A member of parliament no different of what one could meet in Belgium, France, or Britain was not worth a big sketch or a full-page one. So both these great politicians of the Ottonian era were allowed only a small sketch each in a page with other 80 people. Marie much preferred the portraits of quaint personages like a blind man or an almost unknown monk instead, because they wore national dress or were unusual for his audience in Brussels. Even the beggars in Greece were different, so worthy of depiction. On the other hand, Kolettis, depicted in his picturesque dressing gown, was worth a full page. I wonder whether the choice also had something to do with the fact that Kolettis headed the French party and Trikoupis and Mavrokordatos were the top people of the English one. And as already mentioned, Marie was a French party supporter and was slowly coming to a head-on clash with the British minister. I must add a few words about Marie's visit to Cyprus. In December 1844, Cyprus, having been a planned stop on his way to Egypt, was forced, because of bad weather, to spend a number of days there before leaving for Beirut. Based in Larnaca, in spite of the difficulties he faced with his health, he toured the island and reported his impressions to Belgium's foreign minister. He also sketched the Cadi of the city and the Greek bishop, representative both of the two ethnicities living in Cyprus. It should be noted that he visited the island at a calm, almost peaceful period, at which the Hati Sharif, the Imperial Decree of 1839, whereby Sultan Abdulmejid I announced a series of reforms, Tanzimat, with a view to improving the living conditions of all the subjects of the Ottoman Empire, was now in force. The present publication includes Cypriots who had settled in Ottonian Greece and individuals whom Benjamin Marie encountered during his stay on the island on his way to Egypt. In the first category are Agathangelos Myrianthousios, Metropolitan of Lokris, Nikolaos Thysseus and Georgios Savas, who fought in Greece during the Greek Revolution, having taken refuge there after the failure to establish the revolutionary movement on the island. They are the primary reason for the acquisition of the album by the Sylvia Ioannou Foundation. Marie visited Lefkosia, the Latin Nicosia. He also admired Larnaca and Amochosos, the Venetian Famagusta. Impressed by the fortifications, he succeeded in sketching an extremely accurate panorama on 3 large leaves of paper, which have in all probability been preserved in another album, lost for the time being. In his reports, he also gives information on the population and calculates, having combined various estimates, that of the 80,000 living on the island, a quarter were Turks and 3/4 Greeks. Appreciating the crucial geopolitical position occupied by Cyprus, which would serve in the most important way the imperialist policy of Great Britain in the East, Marie does not hesitate to remark to his superior that our very gracious niece, the Queen Victoria, would very happily add this jewel to Malta and Gibraltar, thus shrewdly forecasting the future fate of the island. The book took us long enough to put together, as you heard. The English translation took a year more. That is because translating was not so simple, given the special meaning of quite a lot of words used in the context of the 19th century, and especially the 19th century newspaper jargon. That led to many misapprehensions and continual rewritings and a hard editing job. The results you will be able to judge for yourselves. We hope that we did the best possible job, but it took time and hard work. For that we can vouch. We hope that you will find enough to interest you in this edition, and that it will become an ambassador of Greek things and mainly of the figures of the Greek War of Independence. So look on it as a means of promoting Greek interests in Britain. Thank you.